cousin marriages, marriage between cousins. Opinions and practice vary widely across the world. In some cultures and communities, cousin marriage is considered ideal and actively encouraged. In others, it is subject to social stigma. Cousin marriage is common in the Middle East, for instance, where it accounts for over half of all marriages in some countries. In some countries outside that region, it is uncommon but still legal. In others, it is seen as incestuous and as legally prohibited. It is banned in China and Taiwan, the majority of U.S. states, North Korea and South Korea. Supporters of cousin marriage where it is banned may view the prohibition as discrimination, while opponents may appeal to moral or other arguments. Worldwide, more than 10% of marriages are between first or second cousins. In the past, cousin marriage was practiced within indigenous cultures in Australia, North America, South America, and Polynesia. Various religions have ranged from prohibiting sixth cousins or closer from marrying, to freely allowing first cousin marriage. Cousin marriage is an important topic in anthropology and alliance theory. Children of first cousin marriages may have an increased risk of genetic disorders, but this can only be estimated empirically, and those estimates are likely to be specific to particular populations in specific environments. Some scientists contend that the risk is relatively small at 5%, compared with a 3% risk for children whose parents are not genetically related. History. According to Professor Robin Fox of Rutgers University, 80% of all marriages in history may have been between second cousins or closer. The founding population of Homo sapiens was small, 700 to 10,000 individuals. Therefore, a certain amount of inbreeding is inevitable. Proportions of first cousin marriage in Western countries have declined since the 19th century. In the Middle East, cousin marriage is still strongly favored. Cousin marriage has often been chosen to keep cultural values intact, preserve family wealth, maintain geographic proximity, keep tradition, strengthen family ties, and maintain family structure or a closer relationship between the wife and her in-laws. Many such marriages are arranged. United States cousin marriage was legal in all states before the Civil War. Anthropologist Martin Oppenheimer argues that marriage prohibitions were introduced to maintain the social order, uphold religious morality, and safeguard the creation of fit offspring. Writers such as Noah Webster and ministers like Philip Meledola and Joshua McIlvaine helped lay the groundwork for such viewpoints well before 1860. This led to a gradual shift in concern from affinal unions, like those between a man and his deceased wife's sister, to consanguineous unions. By the 1870s, Louis Henry Morgan was writing about the advantages of marriages between unrelated persons and the necessity of avoiding the evils of consanguine marriage, avoidance of which would increase the vigor of the stock. To many, Morgan included cousin marriage, and more specifically parallel cousin marriage, was a remnant of a more primitive stage of human social organization. Morgan himself had married his cousin in 1853, Indiana 1846, Massachusetts Governor George North Briggs appointed a commission to study idiots in the state, and this study implicated cousin marriages responsible for idiocy. Within the next 2 decades, numerous reports appeared with similar conclusions, that cousin marriage sometimes resulted in deafness, blindness, and idiocy. Perhaps most important was the report of physician Samuel Merrifield Bomis for the American Medical Association, which concluded cousin inbreeding does lead to the physical and mental deprivation of the offspring, despite being contradicted by other studies like those of George George Darwin and Alan Hoot in England and Robert Newman in New York. The report's conclusions were widely accepted. These developments led to 13 states and territories passing cousin marriage prohibitions by the 1880s. Though contemporaneous, the eugenics movement did not play much of a direct role in the bans. George Louis-Arnott in 1908 considered the ban a clumsy and ineffective method of eugenics, which he thought would eventually be replaced by more refined techniques. By the 1920s, the number of bans had doubled. Since that time, Kentucky, Maine, and Texas have also banned cousin marriage. The National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws unanimously recommended in 1970 that all such laws should be repealed, but no state has dropped its prohibition. Europe. Early medieval Europe continued the late Roman ban on cousin marriage under the law of the Catholic Church. Couples were forbidden to marry if they were within 4 degrees of consanguinity. In the 9th century, the Church raised the number of prohibited degrees to 7 and changed the method by which they were calculated. Eventually, the nobility became too interrelated to marry easily as the local pool of unrelated prospective spouses became smaller. Increasingly, large payments to the Church were required for exemptions or retrospective legitimizations of children, in what amounted to a protection racket by the Church. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council reduced the number of prohibited degrees of consanguinity from 7 to 4. The method of calculating prohibited degrees was changed also. Instead of the former practice of counting up to the common ancestor then down to the proposed spouse, the new law computed consanguinity by counting back to the common ancestor. In the Roman Catholic Church, unknowingly marrying a closely consanguineous blood relative was grounds for a declaration of nullity, but during the 11th and 12th centuries, dispensations were granted with increasing frequency due to the thousands of persons encompassed in the prohibition at 7 degrees and the hardships this posed for finding potential spouses. After 1215, the general rule was that while fourth cousins could marry without dispensation, the need for dispensations was reduced. Northern Europe maintained a small proportion of first cousin marriages for centuries. For example, the marriage of Louis XIV of France and Maria Theresa of Spain was a first cousin marriage on both sides. It began to fall out of favor in the 19th century as women became socially mobile. Only Austria, Hungary, and Spain banned cousin marriage throughout the 19th century, with dispensations being available from the government in the last two countries. First cousin marriage in England in 1875 was estimated by George Darwin to be 3.5% for the middle classes and 4.5% for the nobility, though this had declined to under 1% during the 20th century. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert were a preeminent example. The 19th century academic debate on cousin marriage developed differently in Europe and America. The writings of Scottish Deputy Commissioner for Lunacy Arthur Mitchell claiming that cousin marriage had injurious effects on offspring were largely contradicted by researchers such as Alan Hoot and George Darwin. In fact, Mitchell's own data did not support his hypotheses, and he later speculated that the dangers of consanguinity might be partly overcome by proper living. Later studies by George Darwin found results that resembled those estimated today. His father, Charles Darwin, who did marry his first cousin, had initially speculated that cousin marriage might pose serious risks, but perhaps in response to his son's work, these thoughts were omitted from a later version of the book they published. When a question about cousin marriage was eventually considered in 1871 for the census, according to George Darwin, it was rejected on the grounds that the idle curiosity of philosophers was not to be satisfied. Ancient Rome. Cousin and sibling marriage were legal in ancient Rome from the Second Punic War, until it was banned by the Christian Emperor Theodosius I in 381 in the West, and until after the death of Justinian in the East. But the proportion of such marriages is not clear. Anthropologist Jack Goody said that cousin marriage was a typical pattern in Rome, based on the marriage of 4 children of Emperor Constantine to the first cousins, and on writings by Plutarch and Livy indicating the prescription of cousin marriage in the early Republic. Professors Brent Shaw and Richard Saller, however, counter in the more comprehensive treatment that cousin marriages were never habitual or preferred in the Western Empire. For example, in one set of 6 stemata of Roman aristocrats in the 2 centuries after Octavian, out of 33 marriages, none was between first or second cousins. Such marriages carried no social stigma in the late Republic and early Empire. They cite the example of Cicero attacking Mark Antony not on the grounds of cousin marriage, but instead on grounds of Antony's divorce. Shaw and Saller propose in the thesis of low cousin marriage rates that as families from different regions were incorporated into the imperial Roman nobility, exogamy was necessary to accommodate them and to avoid destabilizing the Roman social structure. The data from tombstones further indicate that in most of the Western Empire, parallel cousin marriages were not widely practiced among commoners, either. Spain and Noricum were exceptions to this rule, but even there, the rates did not rise above 10%. They further point out that since property belonging to the nobility was typically fragmented, keeping current assets in the family offered no advantage compared with acquiring it by intermarriage. Jack Goody claimed that early Christian marriage rules forced a marked change from earlier norms to deny heirs to the wealthy and thus to increase the chance that those with wealth would will the property to the church. Shaw and Saller, however, believe that the estates of aristocrats without heirs had previously been claimed by the emperor, and that the church merely replaced the emperor. The view is that the Christian injunctions against cousin marriage were due more to ideology than to any conscious desire to acquire wealth. For some prominent examples of cousin marriages in ancient Rome, such as the marriage of Octavian's daughter to his sister's son, see the Julio-Claudian family tree. Marcus Aurelius also married his maternal first cousin Faustina the Younger, and they had 13 children. Cousin marriage was more frequent in ancient Greece, and marriages between uncle and niece were also permitted there. One example is King Leonidas I of Sparta, who married his half-niece, a Greek woman who became epikleros, or heiress with no brothers, was obliged to marry her father's nearest male kin if she had not yet married and given birth to a male heir. First in line would be either her father's brothers of the sons, followed by her father's sister's sons. According to Goody, cousin marriage was allowed in the newly Christian and presumably also pre-Christian Ireland, where an heiress was also obligated to marry a paternal cousin. For the 7th century, the Irish Church only recognized 4 degrees of prohibited kinship, and civil law fewer. This persisted until after the Norman conquests in the 11th century and the Synod at Cashel in 1101. In contrast, contemporary English law was based on official Catholic policy, and Anglo-Norman clergy often became disgusted with the Irish law of fornication. Finally, Edward Westermarck states that marriage among the ancient Teutons was apparently prohibited only in the ascending and descending lines and among siblings. Middle East cousin marriage has been allowed throughout the Middle East for all recorded history. Anthropologists have debated the significance of the practice. Some view it as the defining feature of the Middle Eastern kinship system, while others note that overall rates rates of cousin marriage have varied sharply between different Middle Eastern communities. Very little numerical evidence exists of rates of cousin marriage in the past. Raphael Partai reports that in Central Arabia, no relaxation of a man's right to the father's brother-daughter seems to have taken place in the past 100 years before his 1962 work. Here the girl is not forced to marry her ibn Amm, but she cannot marry another unless he gives consent. The force of the custom is seen in one case from Jordan when the father arranged for the marriage of his daughter to an outsider without obtaining the consent of her ibn Amm. When the marriage procession progressed with the bride toward the house of the bridegroom, the ibn Amm rushed forward, snatched away the girl, and forced her into his own house. This was regarded by all as a lawful marriage. In Iraq, the right of the cousin has also traditionally been followed, and a girl breaking the rule without the consent of the ibn Amm could have ended up murdered by him. The Syrian city of Aleppo during the 19th century featured a rate of cousin marriage among the elite of 24% according to one estimate, a figure that masked widespread variation. Some leading families had none or only one cousin marriage, while others had rates approaching 70%. Cousin marriage rates were highest among women, merchant families, and older well-established families. Marriage was less frequent in the late pre-Islamic Hijaz than in ancient Egypt. It existed in Medina during Muhammad's time, but at less than today's rates. In Egypt, estimates from the late 19th and early 20th centuries state variously that either 80% of Falahan married first cousins or two-thirds married them, if they existed. One source from the 1830s states that cousin marriage was less common in Cairo than in other areas. In traditional Syria-Palestina, if a girl had no ibn Amm, he renounced his right to her. The next in line was traditionally the ibn Khal and then other relatives. Raphael Partai, however, reported that this custom loosened in the years preceding his 1947 study. In ancient Persia, the Achaemenid kings habitually married their cousins and nieces, while between the 1940s and 1970s, the percentage of Iranian cousin marriages increased from 34 to 44%. Cousin marriage among native Middle Eastern Jews is generally far higher than among the European Ashkenazim, who are assimilated European marital practices after the diaspora. According to anthropologist Ladislav Holy, cousin marriage is not an independent phenomenon, but rather one expression of a wider Middle Eastern preference for agnatic solidarity, or solidarity with one's father's lineage. According to Holy, the oft-quoted reason for cousin marriage of keeping property in the family is, in the Middle Eastern case, just one specific manifestation of keeping intact a family's whole symbolic capital. Close agnatic marriage has also been seen as a result of the conceptualization of men as responsible for the control of the conduct of women. Honor is another reason for cousin marriage. While the natal family may lose influence over the daughter through marriage to an outsider, marrying her in their kin group allows them to help prevent dishonorable outcomes like either attacks on her or her own unchaste behavior. Pragmatic reasons for the husband, such as warmer relations with his father-in-law, and those for parents of both spouses, like reduced bride price and access to the labor of the daughter's children, also contribute. Throughout Middle Eastern history, cousin marriage has been both praised and discouraged by various writers and authorities. A 2009 study found that many Arab countries display some of the highest rates of consanguineous marriages in the world, and that first cousin marriages which may reach 25 to 30% of all marriages. In Qatar, Yemen, and UAE, consanguinity rates are increasing in the current generation. Research among Arabs and worldwide has indicated that consanguinity could have an effect on some reproductive health parameters such as postnatal mortality and rates of congenital malformations. Middle Eastern parallel cousin marriage. Andrei Korotayev claimed that Islamization was a strong and significant predictor of parallel cousin marriage. He has shown that while a clear functional connection exists between Islam and FBD marriage, the prescription to marry a FBD does not appear to be sufficient to persuade people to actually marry. Thus, even if the marriage brings with it economic advantages, according to Korotayev, a systematic acceptance of parallel cousin marriage took place when Islamization occurred together with Arabization. Africa. Cousin marriage rates from most African nations outside the Middle East are unknown. An estimated 35 to 50% of all sub-Saharan African populations either prefer or accept cousin marriages. In Nigeria, the most populous country of Africa, the three largest tribes in order of size are the Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo. The Hausa are overwhelmingly Muslim, though followers of traditional religions do exist. Muslim Hausa practice cousin marriage preferentially, and polygyny is allowed if the husband can support multiple wives. The book Barber of Cairo presents one prominent portrayal of Hausa life. According to its English co-author, it is unknown for Hausa women to be unmarried for any great length of time after around the age of 14. Divorce can be accomplished easily by either the male or the female, but females must then remarry. Even for a man, lacking a spouse is looked down upon. Barber of Caira's first of 4 marriages was to her second cousin. She recounts in the book that her good friend married the friend's first cross-cousin. The Yoruba people are 50% Muslim, 40% Christian, and 10% adherent of their own indigenous religious traditions. A 1974 study analyzed Yoruba marriages in the town Ogorakoko, finding that among a sample of highly polygynous marriages having an average of about 3 wives, 51% of all pairings were consanguineous. These included not only cousin marriages, but also uncle-niece unions. Reportedly, it is a custom that in such marriages at least one spouse must be a relative, and generally such spouses were the preferred or favorite wives in the marriage and gave birth to more children. However, this was not a general study of Yoruba, but only of highly polygynous Yoruba residing in Ogorakoko. Finally, the Igbo people of southern Nigeria specifically prohibit both parallel and cross-cousin marriage, though polygyny is common. Men are forbidden to marry within their own patrilineage of those of the mother or father's mother and must marry outside their own village. Igbo are almost entirely Christian, having converted heavily under colonialism. In Ethiopia, most of the population was historically rigidly opposed to cousin marriage, and could consider up to third cousins the equivalent of brother and sister, with marriage at least ostensibly prohibited out to sixth cousins. They also took our final prohibitions very seriously. The prospect of a man marrying a former wife's sister was seen as incest, and conversely for a woman and her former husband's brother. Though Muslims make up over a third of the Ethiopian population, and Islam has been present in the country since the time of Muhammad, cross-cousin marriage is very rare among most Ethiopian Muslims. In contrast to the Nigerian situation, in Ethiopia, Islam cannot be identified with particular tribal groups and is found across most of them, and conversions between religions are comparatively common. Exceptions to these rules include the overwhelmingly Muslim Somali and Afar peoples, who respectively make up 6.2% and 1.73% of the population. The Afar practice a form of cousin marriage called absuma that is arranged at birth and can be forced. China. Confucius described marriage as the union of two surnames, in friendship and in love. Quote, In ancient China, some evidence indicates in some cases, two clans had a long-standing arrangement wherein they would only marry members of the other clan. Some men also practiced sororate marriage, that is, a marriage to a former wife's sister or a polygynous marriage to both sisters. This would have the effect of eliminating parallel cousin marriages and adoption, but would leave cross-cousin marriage acceptable. In the ancient system of the Uryu dating from around the 3rd century BC, the words for the two types of cross-cousins were identical, with fathers' brothers' children and mothers' sisters' children both being distinct. However, whereas it may not have been permissible at the time, marriage with the mother's sister's children also became possible by the 3rd century AD. Eventually, the mother's sister's children and cross-cousins shared one set of terms, with only the father's brother's children retaining a separate set. This usage remains today, with bio cousins considered outside and paternal tang cousins being of the same house. In some periods in Chinese history, all cousin marriage was legally prohibited, as law codes dating from the Ming dynasty attest. However, enforcement proved difficult, and by the subsequent Qing dynasty, the former laws had been restored. The following is a Chinese poem by Po Chuyi. Anthropologist Francis H. Su described mother's brother's daughter as being the most preferred type of Chinese cousin marriage, mother's sister's daughter as being tolerated, and father's brother's daughter as being disfavored. Some writers report this last form as being nearly incestuous. One proposed explanation is that in FBD marriage, the daughter does not change her surname throughout her life, so the marriage does not result in an extension of the father's kinship ties. In Chinese culture, these patrilineal ties are most important in determining the closeness of a relation. In the case of the MSD marriage, no such ties exist, so consequently this may not even be viewed as cousin marriage. Finally, one reason that MBD marriage is often most common may be the typically greater emotional warmth between a man and his mother's side of the family. Later analyses have found regional variation in these patterns. In some rural areas where cousin marriage is still common, MBD is not preferred but merely acceptable, similar to MSD. By the early to mid-20th century, anthropologists described cross-cousin marriage in China as still permissible, but generally obsolete, or as permitted but not encouraged.